James Ward is in
One
the
and only.
house. Well, as a reminder, we focused on the beginnings of Jim's ministry, his starts to songwriting and college. You gave some great memories at Covenant
turned
College.
for me my morning into dancing.
Yes, hey.
Hey, still got it.
You do. And as wonderful as that is, I really want us to focus on this episode in the ministry of New City Fellowship, because the fabric of our beginnings and the music that you brought, it was really woven miraculously by God in this perfect union, and it was beautiful. And I wanted to capture it, partly for your grandchildren, partly for the world.
All right.
Okay? All right, Jim. Today, as we're focusing and turning into really the ministerial piece of being a worship pastor, there were some very unique beginnings of New City Fellowship and kind of how you wove that together with cross-cultural ministry. And I want to hear about those early days of. I heard Colin Schmidt got fired when she played the piano that first Sunday.
I've heard that story over and over again.
I bet you have.
Yes.
But you tell us your perspective of how it all came to be in the beginnings.
Beth and I were students. We were engaged to be married, and we were students, and we heard that there was this ministry going on downtown, and so we came down, and we've been in churches all our lives doing ministry, so we plugged in where it could fit. And I do recall meeting in a very small apartment. There was no piano, and I don't know how long we used that little chord organ that Colin talked about, but mostly it was singing. The thing I remember was singing and just clapping and leading children in choruses and songs. It's when I wrote a song that is in a hymnal now. It's called Morning Sun, and I wrote that song for that children's Sunday school for Easter Sunday. So it was a fertile time for me to get started doing music that was specifically designed for congregations and groups of people to sing. And I also wrote a setting of the Lord's Prayer, "O Father," for that time because of Will Barker preaching a series on the Lord's Prayer. So good stuff happened.
Beautiful. Now, cross-cultural ministry is something our church has done conferences on. We've done music conferences. You've been a key part of that in terms of teaching.
Yep.
Tell us some of folks could tune in, I guess, to some of those YouTube musical things that are out there. I really don't know what's out there, but give us just a little highlight in terms of capturing some of the key components with cross-cultural ministry, because it is a whole different gorilla.
Yeah, and it's especially important for a person from the dominant culture, which would be Caucasian in our United States right now for a few more years. And the dominant culture working in the context of a minority group, and in the case of our church, it was the African American community in the downtown Chattanooga area, and also with the poor, because many of the people who we were working with were children and living in housing downtown. So here we were, and we're coming in to bring the gospel, but we're not supposed to act like we're the great white hope that's bringing truth where there is no truth. And believe me, I have heard those very kinds of expressions in the last 8 or 10 years used by people who were planting churches here in Chattanooga. They were talking about, we're bringing the gospel to people who are lost and people, whereas there are black churches on corners all over throughout the city.
As if they don't have the gospel.
Yeah, and so it really is important that you not step on a lot of important cultural things that are going on. So I was learning a lot about music and how to play the blues and how to make the piano really talk. And we would go to black churches on Sunday afternoon and we'd listen to them sing.
Oh, nice.
And they would sing stuff like, "There's a leak in this old building and my soul has got to move." And it's a great old song that we learned just by going and listening and recording old songs.
Okay.
So we learned a lot, and
And there's the first point. You made yourself a student.
absolutely,
Of the culture.
yeah, it's like ethnomusicology, if you want to use a fancy term for it. And people who are in missions do this all the time. They go to another culture and they listen and they try to understand what's important in that culture and to respect what can be respected.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we were doing. And of course, in American black culture, there's a strong presence of the gospel and of reliance on God and a need for redemption, a need for being saved, and so that was a joyful part of it, was learning how to express music that way.
Nice. Now, you mentioned blues, you mentioned jazz, you went back and got your master's, you told us last time.
Well, that was when I was 40 years old. That was
later.
Yeah, quite a bit later. And that was after I really had to deal with cross-cultural music and listen to the music of Fred Hammond and listen to the music of Hezekiah Walker in New York. And so many of these gospel records had jazz musicians playing in the background.
Mm-hmm.
You could hear the chords and you could hear the fills and the horns and all. So I went back to school to actually put a name to all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But learning initially was listening to records and finding music that we could use, and also working with black leadership in our own fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And we had one particular singer, Leonard Lewis, who understood how to improvise and to sing powerfully in a soulful way. And all the way back at the very beginning, he was a major factor in how I could interact with the congregation because of the way he would lead singing.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Ooh, what a blessing he has been.
Yeah.
Now, that gets us to the concept that we're not only singing the kind of music that is culturally relevant to the folks we're reaching and cross-cultural ministry with, but the look. Tell me about kind of the choices of people, the stage presence. It's a little different with cross-cultural ministry than you would see in a not monogamous, what's the word?
Monocultural.
Thank you, monocultural look.
Hopefully monogamous.
Yes.
Well, yeah, we finally by 1990 or so, we were occupying a large church building, and you could imagine people coming in the front door and hearing about our church, which all throughout the black community in Chattanooga to this very day, we are considered to be a white church. Mm-hmm. And we have made every effort to understand and inculcate black culture in our worship. But in order to do that, in part, was to make sure that the praise team up front represented black and white leadership. And so as the worship planner, I had to find out who was available and match them up, not only match up colors, but also the strength of people's skills and talents. And when we had a song leader out front, there needed to be somebody who could conduct the congregation. But I was playing the piano, but it was also my job to get people to sing in the praise team and schedule them in such a way they would not be on every week. We used kind of a rotation system. And you were part of that. Mm-hmm. And I would like to say that people would walk in the front door and they would look up front and they would say, I can relate to this. This is my music, or this is what I expect to hear. It also includes having a B3 organ, which is kind of a traditional black gospel instrument from the 50s and 60s on in. And some black churches don't use B3s anymore. They use more synthesizers now with contemporary gospel. But we got this B3 organ, and we have the grand piano up front, and we have drums and bass. And the driving instrument is the piano rather than a guitar, like you might find in white worship circles. You'd have a guitarist leading. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there are well-known black worship leaders who play guitar. And things do change in the black community. They aren't all just static. Right. Israel Houghton, for example, is a guitarist and plays acoustic and electric guitar and leads worship. So it's not necessarily always the piano that drives the music, but in a city like Chattanooga, if you were to go into black churches, primarily it's the keyboard that is the lead instrument.
Still pretty traditional
Yeah,
here.
that's the way it is.
And so that's the way you guys patterned yourself after. We patterned ourselves after in hopes to reach some and be culturally relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure that has challenges through the years. And what would you say some of the challenges have been doing what you just described?
Well, we'd find music and we'd realize that if we were going to use this song, we need to have a really powerful, soulful singer who could wail. And usually in a cross-cultural setting, if you have started the ministry from the white side of the aisle, then you have African Americans who are being drawn into the ministry, but you may not have that many really great smoking singers out front.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look for music that you can use that isn't necessarily reliant on a lot of this wild solo singing that you hear in gospel music.
Mm-hmm.
And that was exasperating because so much of what you hear and so much of what the black worshiper identifies with, you didn't have. You didn't have that one key ingredient. Mm-hmm. Now, I mentioned Leonard Lewis, and Joan Neighbors also was a black soloist that we could rely on. And we've had others in more recent years that have really, really helped out with that. Mm-hmm. Another challenge would be the music was very rarely written down. So you had to transcribe it, or you had to learn it from memory, just by ear. And many of our musicians were not experienced in black gospel music. So I would find myself listening to the music and writing down bass lines, because the bass is a very important instrument in black music. Mm-hmm. It doesn't just go do 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 like so many hill songs do. It has
hill songs, nothing.
It has a movement. It has a lot of motion in the bass line, and it's danceable, and it's really, really important. So all of our bass players were getting schooled every Sunday on how to play good soul bass lines. And we've always had pretty good drummers in our church. So that hasn't been as difficult a problem. But we also had a gospel choir, and that started in the 80s. We had a choir made up of maybe 15 people or so. And it was a great part of our worship. People loved the choir.
Oh, yes.
And it helped us capture the sound of gospel with 3-part harmony, not just congregational singing. But having a choir up front with live instruments meant that the choir has to be really loud. And so you're going to amplify the choir, but after a while, everybody is just roaring. The choir members really have to sing with a lot of energy. And sometimes you hear people who sing gospel music and they've got real scratchy voices because they have really been belting it out for years and years. So these are challenging things for a predominantly white congregation.
Yes.
I think black music is very respectful of hymns and of gospel music from the 19th century. That's not a huge problem, but you need to find hymns that both cultures relate to. Mm-hmm. So I asked Donna one time, I said, okay, if white people like A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, then what would be a black equivalent to A Mighty Fortress Is Our God?
Okay.
And she says, well, like What a Fellowship, or maybe Pass Me Not. She named some other songs that would be just pillars of gospel hymnody. Mm-hmm. And so that's where white worship leaders need to pick one over the other in order to constantly be emphasizing the minority culture. Mm-hmm. It's easy for us all to understand the dominant culture. What we need to really understand is that element that is specific. And I figured out the songs that would make black folks, as it were, in the congregation stand up. I figured out which ones they were.
And again, becoming a student of all of that. Now, this leads me to something, and I wish I could remember the name of the man who published this, but just recently, I want to say it's Michael Rhodes. But there has been an article published where he, and honestly, I don't know if he's African American, but he came up with a kind of research list of the top 25 contemporary songs out there, and
I think I heard about this article.
yeah, very powerful. He was talking about how the top 25 never mention issues of justice, never mention issues of lament. The focus is me, my personal relationship with God, but rarely the more corporate perspective. Talk about that, because we didn't do it that way altogether.
Well, it's hard in early gospel music. It's hard to find the issue of justice, for example, or oppression specifically enumerated. But of course, oppression was there when these songs like Precious Lord, Take My Hand, Lead Me On, Help Me Stand, these songs reflect a hard life. They reflect the people coming into worship and finding in the church a solace and an escape from an otherwise oppressive system, and a place where they may be just on their last nerve all week, and then they come into church, and that's where they can be free to express themselves. So the thing is, though, that in the black church, there was tremendous political strength during the years of Dr. King. Churches were the place where pastors and people would become dynamically involved in the issues of civil rights. And many of the gospel songs became their songs. We Shall Overcome, of course, was derived from an early gospel song. And these tunes were explicitly connected to the issues of justice and personal dignity for Black Americans. Now, the songs that you're talking about, the me and my songs, they come from a very different perspective on the gospel. It's personal, it's about an individual decision, and it's also very contemplative. It's about getting in a room and being very quiet and worshiping and sort of being alone with God. And in gospel music, it's loud, it's celebratory.
Very joyfully.
Yes, it's joyful, and it's gathering together in a room and sharing together. There's a lot of hugging and talking and high-fiving in that type of setting. So many white worshipers would be put off by that kind of worship. They would want it to be more reverential. Now, these songs that on the CCM list that are more focused on personal satisfaction and just on me, they are sung throughout the church. There are a lot of black churches that sing music like that too.
Oh, sure.
It's not just
and good
white people.
music.
Yeah. But looking for ways to write songs that express the concern that God has for the oppressed, that can be accomplished, and we did do that with songs that we sang. And I would write music for the church that would talk about those specific issues. And my son did too. Kirk did too.
Kirk did too, and has. We sing a good bit of Kirk's music.
Yes.
But I just love that, because it's an indication how, and we might not even be aware that this kind of cultural norm is forming around of our music. And CCM tends to be a middle class white expression, and what you're describing is something very different. So it's just good to give consideration to what we do and why we do it.
And and as you said, it's one of the things that makes cross-cultural music very challenging for the worship leader. I have people call me. I have an appointment this week with a man who's going to call me, and I know what he's going to want to know. He's going to want to know, where can I find a musician? What are the priorities of that type of worship? How can I get people of color to be comfortable in my church? These are all questions that are being asked over and over again, because cross-cultural worship is hip. It's in.
It really is. It's become the thing.
Church planters
You're not progressive unless you're doing this.
Yeah,
right?
they want to have a diverse congregation. And so in our case, what are we coming up on, 50 years as a church? So, you know, we did make a strong effort at the beginning, and we did have some wonderful results. We did have blacks in our church with musical skills from the get-go, from the very, very earliest. And so our church, in a way, when people say to me, how can I make my church more diverse? I just kind of go, well, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? Or have you learned this song? Or do you use this song? And there's really no short, quick way to get to this. It sometimes takes a generation or two to accomplish what people want to do that's trendy.
And a lot of intentionality.
Absolutely. Very intentional. Choosing this over that.
Yeah, that's so good. And really, there's a whole legacy that's been formed around this, because a lot of pastors and churches have reached out to our church to kind of model and represent what this would look like. And you're still getting some of that.
Yeah, I got a call from Evan Marbury, who was over in North Carolina, and he and his committee wanted to talk about how to hire a worship leader that would be sensitive to a diverse congregation. So we had a Zoom conversation, and Evan himself is black and is a singer, and he was asking me what I would suggest. And
Evan's good at seeking counsel.
I was glad to be able to talk with them, and there were people on the committee. As I was looking in the Zoom conversation, as I was looking at people in the committee, there were people of color on the committee besides him, which is unusual in a church that wants to be cross-cultural, to have more than one black person on a committee. It's very unusual. It's crazy, but it's true.
Wow.
So he had representation, but as I asked them what their contribution was and what their interests were, sometimes they didn't necessarily have the musical inclination to do what was required. They were on the committee, they were into it, they were they wanted it to happen,
committed
but they
to
didn't
it.
necessarily have the chops to do what was necessary, even if they're musical. Sometimes, you know, it takes a unique gift.
I hear you, and evidently they've gotten some resolution on that, because I worshiped with them about a month ago, and they had some.
They were throwing it down, huh?
Full hands up! We were in it. It was beautiful. So
very good.
They've reconciled something there.
Very good. Well, thank God. He's blessed them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any moments of, I don't know, offense or racial tension, or I'm asking this because, one, we're now in 2021, pretty hostile environment, where there's a lot of easy offense that can happen racially, but we always had a lot of unity, I thought, in our midst. And some of that unity, at least from how I've watched you, is you've done a lot of deferring. You have made yourself a student. You've been humble. You've really deferred to the minority culture, from what I can see. And I'm wondering what you would say about that process.
I think it's similar to people who are in missions, who go into a culture and they want to raise up indigenous, what the term they use is indigenous leadership. And so your job is not to be center stage if you're the music director in a cross-cultural setting. Your job is to make that element where you have leadership develop, and you encourage that and you defer to it. Now in my case, it was my job to drive the bus and help it go where we needed to go. But without making certain kinds of choices, I don't think the black folks would want it to be involved. So they saw early on that there was something happening that they could actually be a part of.
Yeah. Yes.
So that was a tough one. We had to really work at that. And then we had people like Henry Crutcher come in the door, who was an experienced organist, B3 player, and had a lot of experience also with choirs and playing piano and doing gospel music. And having him as a resource, and not a man who would want to march over and say, now you listen to me. But I also was aware when Henry was on board or when he was
not
sort of having something that he needed to say, and I would always let him say it.
It's so good right there.
It's I always, and even if it meant like the tempo of a song. White people do tend to rush music and make it faster than it should be when they're doing gospel for some reason. They can do all the ballads that they want to with their hands in the air, but when it comes to doing gospel, it's just hard for white people to just get down into behind the beat. And sometimes that's what Henry would do. What was funny was Henry would be wanting to have a certain tempo, and Michelle Higgins was Church of God in Christ, and she wanted to have a different tempo. Both black, both from different black traditions. So it was fun to see them
duke it out.
Yeah, have them work it out.
I love that. You know, Gwen Green, I've heard her say many times, when you come to a church like this, everybody has to sacrifice something.
Absolutely.
To make it work. And here, you know, white culture is deferring to allowing the minority culture kind of dominate the worship so that it's relevant and attractive. But meanwhile, black folks are sacrificing the safety of a black congregation, the safety of getting to do things, you know, in ways that were familiar to
Well,
them.
being a majority, I remember going to Africa with Joan Neighbors, who is black, and just realizing that when we got there, that the black folks were in the majority in that place. So even if you were not in a specific location like a church, everywhere you went, there were black people living and enjoying life and making industry and everything, and making the society move forward. And Joan seemed to really love that. She went back over and over again. So that's something that they're really giving up. I grew up in the church. My parents were musical, my siblings were musical, and we didn't sing black gospel music. But I don't recall anyone in this church ever saying to me, what kind of music did you grow up with? And show us something that that is close to your heart. I don't remember ever being asked that. And I think it's because people thought that I was not what I once was.
They didn't realize how far you had come.
They couldn't imagine that. And I think by God's grace, He gave me a love and affection for a type of music that was not indigenous to me.
Absolutely.
It was not my music.
Absolutely. And boy, you embraced it and fully embodied that whole process.
Yeah, I had to.
Oh, it was great. So great. And really has, as I said, just woven the whole culture and presence of what's been happening here for 50 years. So again, thank you for all of that. Oh, so beautiful. I am wondering about the other ways that I've seen you really defer is being a worship pastor. You're a number 2, number 3 man in a sense. And we had some strong leadership here. Randy had clear visions, clear ideas about the way this was going to go down, and a strong leader. Tell me about that process for our worship pastors out there and folks who are kind of in that posture of working with somebody else, who, especially if they're a strong person.
I think everybody who works in a staff position in a church knows that the pastor and the elders call the shots. And it isn't really helpful for you to try to duke it out or have a contest with the pastor for leadership and power. If there's a power struggle between the worship leader and the pastor, then the worship leader is going to go and the pastor will stay. But, you know.
So you can look at it from a posture of job security.
Yeah, well, I think that's a valid position. And for me, coming into a full-time position where I was actually employed by Pastor Randy, I had been working part-time for a couple of decades before I took the full-time position. And I knew that I would probably not get my way if when I came down to specific things that I wanted for my own musical dreams to happen. And that's true. I pretty much had to put my dreams on hold while I was working in the church and look to what was necessary for the church to flourish. And
the greater good.
That's kind of what we're supposed to be doing, I think, in our lives. God often gives us, like it says, trust in the Lord and He'll give you the desires of your heart. So a lot of times it's the desires of your heart that are the problem. And so I think that God gave great blessing on my musical ministry, working for a strong leadership. And it's still sometimes difficult when the leadership sees the potential for what could be, and they verbalize that. When you know what it could be, but you also know what it actually is, and you know the hours and the effort that it has taken to get to this point, and you don't necessarily
see what you're saying.
Yeah, I never was a big dreamer about, if we could only have 100-voice choir. I was never like that. I was thinking, okay, our church has this, and it has this, and it has this. So this is possible.
You're a realist.
And I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do the very best that I can with this. And so it was sometimes it was discouraging to feel that what the efforts that we were doing were not enough. They weren't enough. They were never black enough, for example. I mean, when you have a blended congregation, you're going to get a blended result.
Well, that's true.
You're not going to get a black gospel choir out of a blend of whites and blacks together. You're going to get a different sound. And so sometimes it's the blend that we feel is biblical and good, and we think that's what we see around the throne of God in Revelation. We see all different people worshiping together. And so I think it's a very, very valuable and worthwhile task for us to try to get together.
And that's where our name New City came from, right? It's from that vision of what will be in heaven, where every tribe and nation, I mean, some folks have never even considered, I don't think I considered prior to coming here that, our gender and our marital status will be foregone in heaven, but our ethnicity will not.
That's right.
Every tribe and nation is represented here.
That's
and so
right.
This is a picture. It's good. Now, Jim, you mentioned the discouragement piece, and I'm just curious, how have you maintained resilience? How have you maintained perseverance in the midst of discouraging days?
Well, as a child, I think growing up in a ministry family, my parents both emptied themselves in the service of the kingdom of God all their lives. My mother led me to Christ in a good news club in our basement of our house. And my dad would log all kinds of hours visiting families in the churches that he pastored. And that didn't always go well for them. My dad was asked to leave 2 of his congregations by clerks of session who thought that he was ineffective.
Whoa.
So he served 3 different congregations, and the last 2 both asked him to leave.
So you got to see him work through that process.
Well, I saw him get hurt. I saw him work desperately and tirelessly to do what he thought God wanted him to do, only to have it not be enough. So some of that meant that I kind of needed to hold on loosely and not necessarily look at New City Fellowship as my particular church ministry, that I was building a kingdom, but
that's huge.
This is something where I can fit in and be a part, and
it may be for a time.
Yeah, and I think that, and Beth also was from a ministry family, and a lot of people who are in ministry families know what it's like to take a pay cut. They know what it's like to wait for a long time and see other departments flourish. And those are things that people in ministry experience all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I think that helped me. It helped me to realize that what I was there for was to organize the troops. And in Randy's podcast, I think he talked about the gift of administration, that he did not have that gift.
Right.
And so by God's grace, that's something that I could express and exercise in the music ministry of our church. I had to organize people, and I not only had to organize them, but I had to educate them. So the church is more like an educational institution than it is a performance venue. I see these videos of churches,
so true.
These churches with stages and stage lighting and everything, and I'm looking at situations where people are in a performance mode. And for me, it was educating and teaching people how to do what we were going to do. And also, I think for me, I came off the road. I was a performer and I was an entertainer, and I loved to crack jokes and I loved to be silly. And I got zinged about that a couple of times. One elder asked me not to say something. I was worship leading one Sunday
in a service here.
Yeah, and I introduced myself to the congregation. And after the service was over, he told me that it seemed like I was drawing attention to myself by introducing myself.
Whoa. Okay.
Well, I was speechless. I didn't know what to do, because I looked out and I saw a whole lot of people that I didn't know. And I was introducing myself to them. But to him, I had this personality-driven career that I was working off. And so to him, he was conscious of that in my life and in my contribution.
I thought you were
and
drawing
so
attention.
and so I never introduced myself again.
Whoa, hard to navigate those things, because everybody has a different opinion about it.
And
right?
I hear it now. Now I hear it all the time. I hear on Sunday morning, I hear people get up and introduce themselves. I hear elders. I know that Pastor Kevin is trying to draw teaching elders or ruling elders more into leadership. So people get up and introduce themselves all the time. Nobody thinks anything of it. But it was coming from the job that I had as an entertainer, I think. And so when I was getting into the church, I needed to lay that aside, and I needed to look for what the needs were and to work on those needs and fill them and organize the program. And that's something that it was kind of a long game too. I was not looking to get a lot of results real quick, but I was looking at it as developing a congregational environment that our children could grow up in, and that kids would come into adulthood thinking of the church as a place where you clapped when you praised and you shouted with joy. That's the normal way to worship God. And I always had this image in my mind that, someday people would just jump out of the pews and go out into the aisles and dance. And they did.
Yes,
they did.
Yes,
Pamela is with Jesus now, but she would come out into the aisles, and Clarice, and they would walk down the aisles. And I think the reason Clarice did it is because she went to Africa and she worshiped at New City in Nairobi, and that's what they did there. The Indian women would come out and they would do this sort of a slow motion movement.
The light bulb changing.
Yeah, this movement in the aisles. And now that I'm in the pews, and I'm sitting there each Sunday thinking, should I be getting out in the aisles and dancing right now? And then I think to myself, oh, that would be drawing attention to myself.
The censoring of yourself was there.
So I'm so conflicted sometimes.
I bet you were.
I want to lead the congregation if they need to be led, but it was tricky.
Tricky. Now you said something there about the way you wanted to imprint children for joyful worship. And actually, I think one of your very last albums was a children's album. Is that right?
It was, yeah.
What motivated that?
Ooh, what a great lead-in to all the therapy that I got when
Oh.
I was working in this job.
Yay, therapy!
That was a therapy record.
Okay.
That was a therapy record, first and foremost. Now, it is a children's album, yes. And Beth and I were talking about the children's songs that I had led in worship here, and also some that I had written already for our kids, for our children. And then I wrote a few more songs for the album that were about our grandchildren.
Oh.
Well, some of it was that I just needed to get into the studio and do something that wasn't working. When you're working with the congregation, you're trying to please them, and you're trying to please the pastor, and you're trying to make sure that everybody sees that we're all worshiping God here together. Whereas when I'm going to the studio, I'm doing something for my own creative development.
Yeah.
And I did
that's what that was.
Yeah, I did vocal arrangements, and I charted them all out, and I went out and I sang all the vocals. So I learned the harmonies, and we put all the vocals on. I don't think there's any other vocalists on that record.
Yeah.
But I used that opportunity to learn to write some vocal arrangements. But yeah, we had some children's songs that we on that record that we had used here in church.
That's so awesome. Give us a lick of "Hold Me, Jesus." Is that the name of it? Hold me.
Hold me, Jesus. Hold me, Jesus. When I'm too tired to walk.
Yeah.
Or I need to have a talk.
I love that. That's so good.
And that was written for Kirk.
Yeah. That song was written for
That
Kirk.
song was written for Kirk.
Oh, how sweet.
He would, when he was a child, we'd be walking somewhere, and he would put out his arms and say, "Hold me."
Oh, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
And oh my goodness, this is bringing up all kinds of memories at your concert where you featured that. You had bubble gum everywhere. So fun.
Yeah, that was our premiere.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used
So
bubble
great.
gum as a supporting part of the performance.
Oh, good memories.
Yeah.
Now, Jim, one thing that all of this is bringing up is, as you were sharing about educating and leading through that, you've done probably the best job of anybody I know in our church in terms of attempting to mentor, attempting to duplicate yourself, attempting to raise up next generations. I mean, you have tirelessly poured into people. And I mean, just again, that to me, that speaks so much of your character, that you really didn't try to be the limelight, that you were always kind of investing and pouring into others to disciple and raise up other generations.
Yeah.
And you've done that and sent folks off. But tell me kind of what gave you a vision of that, and what's been some of the process of that.
Well, when I was an entertainer, I would meet kids and I'd meet younger musicians. And once in a great while, I'd actually have an interaction with younger musicians. And people would bring them up and say, my son's a songwriter, do you have any tips for him? But it was actually when I came off the road, when I first came off the road from entertaining, I came to the church and I asked them if I could have a job, and they said, "No, we just hired Mike Higgins. We don't have any money to hire you." And the Lord took me then into education. For 5 years. I taught at the local Christian school. So I was in the classroom, I was teaching jazz band, I was teaching choir, and during those 5 years, I made more friends from high school kids. And it is exhilarating, Shan, to see a child come into, and I mean child like a sophomore or a freshman in high school, come into a jazz band setting, and 4 years later go off to the University of Tennessee to major in music and learn to play jazz.
So that really jazzed you.
I saw up close and personal, I saw kids actually get the bug, for playing music. One of those students is in music theater today professionally. She was a student of mine, and we did a couple of musicals, and they weren't all that great, but she really, really got the bug for that. Another one is a bass player now in Knoxville, and his parents came in and met with me and said, "Do you think he's got what it takes?" And I say, "Well, yeah, I kind of do." And so from being in a band in high school, so I think coming into the church And from education like that, helped me to realize that we did need to develop the next generation. It wasn't just about what we were doing ourselves, but we needed to pass it on to the next ones. And I think Randy had already initiated an internship program in the summers.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd have interns here for working with kids, we'd have interns for youth, we'd have interns in the music department. And
so let's give him a little kudo there too. He was mentoring as well and
yeah,
had a vision
yeah, he
for
knew.
raising it up.
I think he knew that we needed to get kids into paid positions during the summertime to make the church's ministries flourish during the summertime. Well, in the music department, we had a couple of music interns, and some of them were real obvious choices. Some of them were people who were gifted musicians and they were interested in worship music. And some of them, I remember one, Randy got an application from this person and he said, Jim, you know, if you can handle this, more power to you, you know. You don't have to take this person on, he would say. And so sometimes the internships were really kind of polishing off a very rough stone.
Some rougher than others.
Yeah, and yet over the period of time that I was here, we had about 36 interns come through, and maybe 7 of those are in active worship ministry today.
Nice.
Now I don't know what the percentages are supposed to be, but there was a period of time where I thought, you know, I wish we could have a school, you know, for contemporary worship. And I could see it right out there on the lawn. And there was a woman in our church named Dr. J. And she said, yeah, I can help you with that. And she wanted to help me put together a board and raise money and buy a building. And we were going to lunch and talking and dreaming dreams for a while. And then finally I began to realize that what Dr. J was talking about was me going out and raising money and somebody like Michelle Higgins running the program. And I thought to myself, do I really want to be a fundraiser? Is that what I'm called to be? Am I supposed to be raising funds? And so I kind of backed away from that level of ambition. And instead, through the internship program, we've done the same thing. We've ended up with, like I said, about 35 people came through, and I'd say 7, and I don't expand numbers. I try to look realistically at what we've accomplished. And then since I left, there's continued to be an internship program, including your daughter has been a part of that, and
hugely formative.
And Mariel is just an example of a child growing up in a setting where the music is a particular thing, and she acquires a skill that we didn't even know she had just by being in the moment.
And you're developing their ears, you're developing their vision, you're developing their passion.
Yeah, she's a very cause-oriented person.
Oh, she's all about it. She would love to be the next whatever, you know, to follow in
Well,
the
may
footsteps.
God make her that. May God lead her or order her steps in that way.
Yeah. And I know there's many others, whether it's impacting our children or impacting our own hearts or whatever it is that you have been so influential in being a part of. So as we're wrapping up here, I just want to, again, thank you for being part of all of this. Again, for your character, for your integrity, for your perseverance, your resilience. I can't only imagine that it's not always been easy. So thank you. Any parting words, Jim, for folks?
Well, everyone in music ministry has talent. You wouldn't be doing it if you weren't talented. And that talent is often affirmed by people. Almost every week, somebody's saying, you have such a gift, or you're so amazing. And so that's great for people to tell you that you're amazing. But when it comes to doing work in a church and working with volunteers and having people tell you, no, I can't serve, no, I won't be there this week, I'm running late, all these kinds of things, it still has to go on. And so at that point, you realize it's only God's grace that can sustain you.
Amen.
It's not talent.
Yes. Oh, there's a word. Listen, this right here.
Talented people can become vicious. Talented people can become imperious. They can become prideful, vindictive,
yes,
perfectionistic. Talent is a wonderful thing.
But it only gets you so far.
It is only God's merciful grace that enables you to take something that is His gift anyway, a talent, and make it into a thing of beauty and of sharing and of generosity and giving it back to the community, taking a gift and giving it back to the community, and only God can do that.
That is so
Only
true.
God can do
Powerful word. And really all those Psalms that tell us to praise Him and to let it be an incense that comes up before the Lord. That's it.
Amen.
Right there. Yeah. Thank you so much. What an honor. Y'all, James Ward. Thank you so much. I pray this can sit out there on YouTube and every one of your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren gets to hear.
I want you grandchildren to watch this video from beginning to end.
Your great-grandfather. Thank you, Jim.
So His honor may remain in my body, so His honor may be seen. If I live or if I die, I may even have to die, so His honor